Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath in, and let it out. Tonight, we are going to travel back in time. Not a few hundred years. Not a few thousand years. We are going back 900,000 years. To a world so ancient that the continents looked almost the same as today, but the creatures walking across them were not quite us. Not yet. They were our ancestors. Early humans. Homo erectus, or perhaps an even earlier form of what would eventually become you and me. They walked upright. They used simple tools. They lived in small groups, following animals across vast landscapes, sleeping beneath open skies. And then, something happened. Something so catastrophic, so complete, so total, that the entire human population of planet Earth collapsed. Not to millions, not to thousands, to approximately 1,280 individuals. Let that number settle for a moment. 1,280 people. That is smaller than a single apartment complex in a modern city. Smaller than the crowd at a local football match. Smaller than the number of students in a single school. And yet, from those 1,280 souls, every single human being alive today is descended. Every person who has ever loved. Every person who has ever dreamed. Every scientist, every artist, every farmer, every child, traces their beginning back to that tiny, terrified group of survivors huddled somewhere on a changing, violent Earth. Tonight we explore what happened. We will follow the science that uncovered this ancient mystery. We will walk through the theories, the climate shifts, the volcanic catastrophes, the disappearing landscapes that may have brought our species to the very edge of forever. We will ask the questions that keep paleontologists and geneticists awake at night. How did we survive? Why did we survive? And what does our survival, 900,000 years ago, tell us about who we are today? So settle in. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let your breathing slow. And let my voice carry you back, through time, to the moment humanity almost ended. The story of our near extinction was not discovered in a cave. It was not uncovered by archaeologists brushing dust from ancient bones. It was found in us, in our DNA. For decades, geneticists studying human populations noticed something strange. When they looked at the genetic diversity of human beings, the variety of genetic differences between individuals, something did not add up. Humans, as a species, are remarkably similar to each other genetically. Far more similar than you might expect for a species that has lived on Earth for nearly 3 million years. To understand why this is strange, consider chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have lived in Africa for millions of years, in relatively small populations. And yet, genetically, two chimpanzees from different parts of Africa can be more different from each other than a human from Norway is from a human from Nigeria. Think about that. Our closest living relative, a species with a much smaller population, has more genetic diversity than we do. What? The answer, geneticists realized, was a bottleneck. A population bottleneck is what happens when a species is reduced to a very small number of individuals. When that happens, most of the genetic diversity in the species is lost, because most of the individuals carrying unique genetic variations are gone. The survivors pass on only their genes. And the genetic diversity of the entire future species is limited to whatever those survivors happen to carry. Think of it like a fire destroying a library. If a great library burns down and only one small room survives, the entire future of that library's collection is limited to what was in that one room. All the other books, all that unique knowledge, is gone forever. That is what a bottleneck does to a species. And human genetics showed the unmistakable fingerprints of exactly that kind of event. For years, scientists estimated that this bottleneck had occurred around 70,000 years ago, connected to the eruption of the Toba supervolcano in what is now Indonesia. That theory had been popular for decades. But in 2023, a landmark study changed everything. A team of researchers led by geneticist Wang Jie, who, publishing in the journal Science, used a new computational method called FIT-CoL, Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent, to analyze the genomes of modern humans with unprecedented precision. FIT-CoL allowed scientists to look back through the layers of human DNA like reading rings in a tree trunk, each layer representing a generation, each variation in the pattern telling a story about population size at a given moment in time. And what they found was extraordinary. Approximately 900,000 years ago, not 70,000 but 900,000, the human population collapsed. Collapsed from an estimated population of perhaps 100,000 individuals, down to approximately 1,280 breeding individuals. The population remained at this desperately low level for approximately 117,000 years. 117,000 years. To put that in perspective, all of recorded human history from the first writing in Mesopotamia to today covers only about 5,000 years. Our ancestors survived at the edge of extinction for 23 times longer than all of recorded history. The implications were staggering. The study estimated that approximately 98.7% of the human lineage was lost during this period. Nearly 99% of our ancestors died without descendants. The genetic legacy of almost an entire species, gone. And the small group that survived became everyone, every eye color, every skin tone, every blood type. Every genetic variation in the entire human species today came from the survivors of that ancient catastrophe. Scientists also noted something else in the genetic record. During this bottleneck period, something remarkable happened. Two separate ancestral chromosomes, what would eventually become human chromosomes 2A and 2B, fused together into a single chromosome. This fusion, which distinguishes human DNA from the DNA of our closest primate relatives, appears to have occurred during or shortly after this bottleneck. In other words, the crisis that almost ended humanity may have also triggered one of the key genetic events that made us human. The near extinction and the emergence of modern human genetics may be the same story. Breathe slowly. Let these numbers drift through your mind like distant stars. 1,280 people. 117,000 years. And from that narrow thread of survival, everyone. 900,000 years ago, something shifted in the rhythm of the Earth itself. Not suddenly. Not in a single catastrophic moment. But slowly, over thousands of years, the climate of our planet changed in a way it had never changed before in human memory. Scientists call it the mid-Pleistocene transition. And it may be the reason our ancestors nearly disappeared. 4 million years before this event, the Earth had moved through regular cycles of ice ages and warmer periods. These cycles were driven by subtle changes in the Earth's orbit around the Sun. Slight wobbles and tilts that affected how much sunlight reached different parts of the planet. These cycles repeated roughly every 41,000 years. Cold, then warm, then cold, then warm. A rhythm as regular as breathing. Early humans had evolved within this rhythm. They had learned to survive its changes. They followed the animals that moved with the climate. They found shelter in caves and rock overhangs. They moved south when the ice advanced and north when it retreated. They were adaptable. They were resilient. And then, the rhythm changed. Around 900,000 years ago, the cycle shifted. The ice ages became longer. The cold period stretched from 41,000 years to 100,000 years. And they became more severe. The ice sheets that advanced from the poles were larger than anything that had come before. They covered vast areas of land that had previously been hospitable. Forests shrank. Grasslands disappeared under ice and permafrost. Rivers froze. Lakes dried up. The animals that early humans depended on for food either migrated far beyond reach, or went extinct themselves. And the food sources that remained were scattered, unreliable, and fiercely competed for. Imagine what this meant for small groups of early humans. A family group, perhaps 30 or 40 individuals, living on the edge of a great African forest. For generations, they had hunted the animals that grazed at the forest's edge. They had gathered fruits and roots and tubers from the woodland floor. They had drunk from rivers that flowed year-round. And then, slowly the range changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But year by year the dry seasons grew longer. The rivers ran lower. The forest edge retreated. The animals moved away, following the shrinking grasslands. The group followed. But wherever they moved, the same story waited for them. Less food. Less water. More competition. Groups that had never encountered each other before now competed for the same dwindling resources. Some merged. Some fought. Many simply faded away. Children who might have survived in better times did not survive. Elders who could not keep pace with constant movement were left behind. Births declined as bodies under stress produced fewer offspring. And slowly, across an entire species, the numbers fell. The African continent, long the heartland of human evolution, was particularly affected. Studies of ancient pollen records, lake sediments, and geological formations from this period show clear evidence of dramatic climate shifts across Africa 900,000 years ago. Forests fragmented into isolated patches. What had been continuous woodland became scattered islands of vegetation separated by expanding deserts and dry savannas. Each patch of forest became a refuge, and the human groups sheltering in those refuges became isolated from each other, separated by landscapes too harsh to cross. This isolation had a double effect. First, it reduced the total population by limiting access to resources. Second, it reduced genetic exchange between groups, accelerating the loss of diversity. A species that is spread across a landscape can survive the loss of one group because others survive elsewhere. But a species fragmented into isolated pockets, each too small and too stressed to grow, is a species in danger. Climate modeling studies published alongside the 2023 genetic research confirmed this picture. Using sophisticated computer models of ancient climate patterns, researchers showed that the period between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago was characterized by widespread African aridification, the spreading of dry, desert-like conditions across previously fertile regions. The timing matched the genetic bottleneck almost exactly. This was not coincidence. The climate had turned against us. The Earth that had nurtured human evolution for millions of years had shifted into a new, harsher mode, and our ancestors had nearly paid the ultimate price. Rest in this moment? The cold was vast, the hunger was real, and yet, someone survived. Deep beneath the surface of our planet, forces move that make human history look like a single breath. Magma chambers the size of cities, building pressure over thousands of years. Tectonic plates grinding against each other in geological slow motion. Ancient wounds in the Earth's crust, waiting for the moment when the pressure becomes too much. And 900,000 years ago, one of those wounds may have opened. Most people who know about volcanic catastrophes and human evolution have heard of Toba. The Toba supervolcano erupted approximately 74,000 years ago on the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years. It ejected roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which devastated hundreds of square miles of Pacific Northwest landscape, ejected about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba ejected nearly 3,000 times more. The ash cloud from Toba circled the globe. Sulfur dioxide gas converted to sulfuric acid in the upper atmosphere, creating a reflective layer that blocked sunlight. Global temperatures dropped by several degrees. What is known as a volcanic winter descended on the planet, lasting years or even decades. The Toba catastrophe theory proposed that this eruption contributed to a human population bottleneck around 70,000 years ago. But the new genetic evidence pointed to a bottleneck 900,000 years ago, more than 800,000 years before Toba. So the question arose, was there another supervolcano? An earlier catastrophe? A Toba before Toba? The geological record from this period is incomplete. 900,000 years ago is a very long time, and the evidence of ancient volcanic events is often buried, eroded, or subducted back into the Earth's mantle over geological timescales. But there are tantalizing clues. Several large volcanic events are known to have occurred in the general timeframe of the mid-Pleistocene transition. The Campi Flegrei caldera in what is now southern Italy shows evidence of significant activity during this period. Volcanic provinces in East Africa, a region of intense geological activity along the Great Rift Valley, also show elevated activity. East Africa is particularly significant, because East Africa is where the earliest evidence of human habitation is concentrated. And the Great Rift Valley, a geological scar running from Ethiopia down through Kenya and Tanzania, sits atop some of the most volcanically active terrain on the planet. If a major eruption occurred in or near East Africa 900,000 years ago, the effects on the local human population could have been immediate and catastrophic. Volcanic winters work through a brutal mechanism. First, the ash itself. Thick layers of volcanic ash smother vegetation, contaminate water sources, and make the land uninhabitable for years or decades. Then the gases. Sulfur dioxide and other volcanic gases injected into the upper atmosphere create a reflective shield that reduces solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface. Global temperatures fall. Growing seasons shorten. Plant life is stressed across vast areas. Then the cascade. Animals that depend on plants decline. Predators that depend on those animals follow. And at the top of the food chain, already stressed by climate change, already fragmented into isolated refuges, small groups of early humans face starvation. A volcanic catastrophe layered on top of an already deteriorating climate would have been devastating. Some researchers have proposed that the bottleneck may not have had a single cause at all, but rather a perfect storm of catastrophes converging at the same moment. Deteriorating climate from the mid-Pleistocene transition. Possible volcanic activity. Fragmented habitats. Isolated populations unable to recover or reinforce each other. Each factor alone might have been survivable. Together they created a crisis that nearly ended everything. This is sometimes called the catastrophic convergence hypothesis. The idea that our near extinction was not the result of one disaster, but the collision of many. One disaster on top of another, and still, they survived. When everything is dying around you, where do you go? When the forests shrink and the rivers dry and the animals disappear and the cold creeps closer each winter, where do you find the place that keeps you alive? For our ancestors 900,000 years ago, the answer was refugia. Refugia, from the Latin word for refuge, are the small pockets of habitable land that survive within a landscape that has otherwise become uninhabitable. Islands of livability in a sea of devastation. When glaciers advance and climates shift, most of a landscape becomes too cold, too dry, or too barren to support life. But in certain sheltered spots, a valley protected from the wind, a coastline warmed by an ocean current, a highland plateau that catches just enough rain, life hangs on. These are refugia. And they saved us. Scientists studying ancient human genetics and climate modeling have proposed several locations that may have served as refugia during the bottleneck period. The first and most likely is East Africa. The region around the East African Rift Valley contains an extraordinary diversity of microclimates, small pockets of different environmental conditions packed into a relatively small geographic area. High-altitude plateaus where temperatures remain cool and stable. Rift Valley floors where volcanic springs create oases of warmth and moisture. Coastal regions where ocean breezes moderate the climate. Even as the broader African climate became more arid, some of these microenvironments may have remained productive enough to support small human populations. Evidence from ancient lake sediments in the East African Rift Valley suggests that some lakes remained stable during this period even as surrounding regions dried out. These lake environments would have provided reliable water, fish, and the plant and animal life that depends on water. A small group of humans living near a stable lake in a sheltered valley, protected from the worst of the climate shifts, could survive. The second proposed refugium is the North African coast. During periods of global glaciation, sea levels drop as water is locked up in ice sheets. This exposes new land along coastlines, land that can be remarkably productive. Exposed continental shelves create new habitats for plants and animals. Tidal zones provide seafood. Coastal forests, moderated by ocean temperatures, remain more stable than interior landscapes. Archaeological evidence from much later periods, the Middle Stone Age around 100,000 years ago, shows that coastal environments were crucial refuges for modern Homo sapiens during periods of stress. Shells from coastal shellfish have been found at inland sites far from the coast, suggesting that humans were moving between coastal resources and interior landscapes. It is plausible that similar coastal refugia played a role 900,000 years ago. The third possibility is perhaps the most extraordinary: South Asia and the Middle East. Some researchers have proposed that part of the surviving human population may not have remained in Africa at all. The genetic evidence suggests that the population that survived the bottleneck eventually gave rise to both African and non-African human lineages, suggesting either that some survivors left Africa before the recovery, or that there was more population structure than previously understood. If small groups had already dispersed into the Middle East or South Asia before the bottleneck, following game animals along the ancient land routes out of Africa, they might have found refugia in the highlands of what is now Yemen, or in the river valleys of what is now Pakistan or India. These are speculative ideas. The evidence is thin. But the genetic data demands an explanation for where all these people went, and the answer may be more geographically complex than we imagined. What is clear is that survival was not passive. Our ancestors did not simply huddle in a cave and wait for things to get better. They adapted. They innovated. They changed their behavior to meet the demands of a changing world. Evidence from archaeological sites dating to the general period of the Middle Pleistocene shows gradual but significant changes in tool technology. Stone tools became more refined. There is tentative evidence of increased use of fire that could extend the range of habitable environments, cook a wider variety of foods, and defend against predators. There is evidence of increased dietary flexibility, a willingness to eat things that earlier hominins had ignored. Shellfish, underground tubers, seeds. The survivors were not picky. They ate whatever kept them alive. And they remembered knowledge of where the water was, which plants were safe to eat, which routes led to better hunting grounds. This knowledge, passed from parent to child across hundreds of generations of scarcity, became the foundation of human culture. The crisis that nearly killed us may have been the pressure that made us smarter. In the smallest places, in the most sheltered corners of a hostile world, 1,000 people held on. There is a phenomenon in biology called the founder effect. When a population is reduced to a very small number of individuals, and then recovers, the recovered population carries only the genetic material of those few survivors. The range of variation is narrow. But within that narrow range, certain traits may become fixed that were previously rare. In other words, a bottleneck does not just reduce a population. It reshapes it. And the bottleneck our ancestors survived 900,000 years ago may have done something extraordinary. It may have accelerated the very evolutionary changes that eventually made us. Consider the chromosome fusion we mentioned earlier. Human beings have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have 48 chromosomes, 24 pairs. The difference is explained by the fusion of two ancestral chromosomes, which scientists call 2A and 2B, into the single chromosome we now call chromosome 2. This fusion is found in every human being alive today. Every person from every culture, every part of the world, carries this fused chromosome. And the genetic evidence suggests that this fusion occurred during or very shortly after the bottleneck period, approximately 900,000 years ago. This is significant for a simple reason. In a large, genetically diverse population, a chromosomal mutation like this would have an extremely difficult time spreading. The individual carrying it would need to successfully breed with partners who also happen to carry it, an unlikely event in a large population. But in a tiny population of 1,280 individuals, genetic changes can spread much faster. What might take millions of years to become universal in a large population could become fixed in a small one within a few thousand generations. The bottleneck may have been the very mechanism by which this fundamental human genetic characteristic became universal. Beyond chromosomes, researchers have proposed that the bottleneck may have accelerated other crucial human traits. Increased brain capacity. The archaeological record shows that brain size in human ancestors increased significantly during the Middle Pleistocene, the same broad period as the bottleneck. Larger brains require more calories, more developmental time, and more parental investment. They are, in normal circumstances, a costly luxury. But in a crisis that rewards problem-solving, innovation, and social cooperation, larger brains become a survival advantage. The individuals who could find new food sources, devise new tools, and coordinate more effectively with their group were the ones who survived. And their descendants inherited their capacity for these things. Language and social complexity may also have been shaped by this period. A group of 1,280 people living under extreme stress is a group that depends on communication, cooperation, and social cohesion for survival. Individuals who could communicate more precisely, warning of danger, sharing information about resources, coordinating group activities, had a survival advantage. The pressure of the bottleneck may have been a powerful selective force for the development of more sophisticated communication systems. We cannot know for certain. Language leaves no fossils. But the logic is compelling. The worst crisis in human history may have been the school in which human language began to take shape. There is also the question of culture. One of the most extraordinary things about human beings is our ability to accumulate knowledge across generations, to build on what our ancestors learned rather than starting from scratch in each lifetime. Anthropologists call this cumulative culture. It is the reason we can build skyscrapers and spacecraft. Not because any individual is smarter than any other animal, but because we can stand on the shoulders of everyone who came before us. The origins of this cumulative culture are debated. But the bottleneck period is a compelling candidate for when it truly began to matter. In a group of 1,280 people under existential pressure, the ability to pass knowledge reliably to the next generation was not a luxury. It was survival. The elder who remembered where the water was during the last long drought. The parent who taught the child which roots were safe to eat and which were poisonous. The group leader who recalled the route to the highland pastures where animals still grazed. Their knowledge kept people alive. And the cultural systems that preserved and transmitted that knowledge were selected for generation after generation, because the alternative was extinction. The pressure of almost disappearing made us everything we are. Science is not a single voice. It is a conversation. Sometimes a debate. And the story of the 900,000-year bottleneck, remarkable as it is not without its critics. Let us sit with the uncertainty for a moment, because uncertainty, honestly held, is itself a kind of wisdom. The 2023 study that identified the bottleneck was groundbreaking. But some scientists have raised important questions about its methods and conclusions. The Fit-Cole method, the computational tool used to analyze ancient population sizes, is powerful, but it makes assumptions. It assumes certain rates of genetic mutation. It assumes certain patterns of population structure. If any of those assumptions are even slightly off, the resulting estimates could be significantly different. Some researchers have pointed out that what looks like a single global bottleneck in the genetic data could alternatively be explained by population structure, a situation where the ancestral human population was divided into several isolated groups that rarely interbred. In this model, the apparent loss of diversity is not the result of most people dying, but of most groups living separately without exchanging genes. This is a meaningful distinction. A structured population can show genetic patterns similar to a bottleneck without the dramatic population crash. Other scientists have questioned the timing. The fossil record of human ancestors, fragmented and incomplete as it is, does not show a clear disappearance of human populations around 900,000 years ago. Hominin fossils from this period are rare, but they exist on multiple continents, suggesting that human ancestors were not reduced to a single tiny group in a single location. How do we reconcile widespread fossil evidence with genetic evidence of a tiny surviving population? One possibility is that the fossils represent lineages that eventually went extinct, populations that survived for a time but ultimately did not contribute to the modern human lineage. The bottleneck, in this view, affected the specific ancestral line that gave rise to modern humans, not all hominin populations everywhere. This is plausible. But it requires careful interpretation of limited evidence. There are also alternative explanations for the genetic patterns observed. Some researchers have proposed that ancient episodes of hybridization, interbreeding between different hominin species, could create genetic patterns that resemble a bottleneck. If the ancestors of modern humans interbred with another hominin population, the genetic signature of that mixing could look, in certain analyses, like a reduction in diversity. We know that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans in more recent times. Could similar events in deeper prehistory be creating false signals of a bottleneck? The researchers behind the 2023 study addressed these concerns, but acknowledged that the picture remains incomplete. More ancient DNA recovered from fossils of the right age and condition could help resolve these debates. And the search for that evidence continues. What the scientific community broadly agrees on is this. Something unusual happened to the human lineage approximately 900,000 years ago. The genetic record shows a significant reduction in diversity during this period. The climate record shows a major transition in Earth's glacial cycles at approximately the same time. The fossil record is sparse enough to be consistent with a severe population reduction. Whether that reduction was as dramatic as 1,280 individuals, or somewhat larger, or structured differently than the 2023 study proposes, these are questions still being worked out. But the broad outline of the story, a catastrophic crisis, a narrow survival and the recovery that followed, is supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. And that story is extraordinary, however the details are eventually filled in. Science does not always give us certainty. But sometimes, it gives us something better. A deeper question. A wider wonder. They survived. After 117,000 years at the edge of extinction, they survived. We do not know exactly how. We do not know the names of the individuals whose descendants eventually filled the earth. We do not know which single decision, which migration, which discovery, which chance encounter, tipped the balance from extinction to recovery. But the genetic record tells us that around 813,000 years ago, the population began to grow again. slowly at first, tentatively, like a fire catching in damp wood, hesitant, small, uncertain. And then, it grew. What changed? The most likely answer is the climate. The mid-Pleistocene transition eventually stabilized into a new pattern. The ice ages were longer and more severe than before, but they were also punctuated by warmer interglacial periods that were, in some ways, more hospitable than anything that had come before. These warm periods, called interglacials, brought expanding forests, refilling lakes, returning herds of animals. The refugia that had kept small human groups alive suddenly became launching pads for expansion. Groups that had been isolated from each other for thousands of years began to make contact again. Genetic diversity, lost during the bottleneck, began very slowly to rebuild as populations mixed. The first expansions were modest. A group moving from one valley to the next. A migration following a river upstream into new territory. A crossing of a land bridge exposed by low sea levels. But each expansion created the possibility of the next one. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors spread. Across Africa first. Then, following ancient routes that our ancestors had perhaps traversed before the bottleneck, out of Africa and into the wider world. Into the Middle East. Into South Asia. Into East Asia. Eventually into Europe. Each migration was an adventure into the unknown. Each new landscape demanded new adaptations. New foods, new shelters, new tools, new ways of organizing social groups. And at each step, the descendants of the survivors proved equal to the challenge. By the time Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, emerged around 300,000 years ago, the recovery was well underway. The population was still small by modern standards. But it was growing. And it was spreading. By 70,000 years ago, the time of the Toba eruption that caused a second, smaller bottleneck, there were enough humans alive that even another catastrophic reduction did not end the story. By 10,000 years ago, the dawn of agriculture, the human population had reached perhaps 5 to 10 million people. By the time of the Roman Empire, approximately 300 million. By 1800, 1 billion. By 1927, 2 billion. And today, 8 billion. 8 billion human beings. Each one carrying, in their cells, the genetic legacy of 1,280 survivors who refused, who perhaps did not even know they were refusing, to disappear. Every one of those 8 billion people is a testament to those survivors. To the mother who found food when there was no food. To the father who led his family to shelter when the landscape offered none. To the child who survived a winter that should have killed them. To the elder whose knowledge kept the group together when everything else was falling apart. We do not know their names. We never will. But we carry them with us. In every heartbeat. In every breath. In every moment of consciousness and wonder and love. They are in us. Why does this matter? Why should we, living in a world of 8 billion people, connected by satellites and smartphones and global supply chains, care about a crisis that happened 900,000 years ago? Because the story of our near extinction is not just history. It is a mirror. First, it tells us something about human unity. Every human being alive today, every person of every race, every culture, every nation, every faith, is descended from the same tiny group of survivors. The genetic diversity that exists between human populations is, in evolutionary terms, extraordinarily small. The differences that we build our prejudices and our borders and our conflicts around are, at the deepest biological level, almost nothing. We are all of us cousins. Distant cousins, perhaps. But cousins nonetheless. The ancestors of a person from Sweden and a person from Nigeria and a person from Japan and a person from Brazil all sat around the same small fires, in the same desperate refugia, 900,000 years ago. We came from the same place. We carry the same basic story. Second, it tells us something about resilience. Our species has faced catastrophe before. We have been reduced to numbers so small that, by any reasonable biological calculus, we should have gone extinct. And we did not. Not because we were the strongest. Not because we were the fastest or the most ferocious. But because we were adaptable. Because we could cooperate. Because we could learn and remember and teach. These capacities, cooperation, learning, cultural transmission, are what saved us then. And they are what will determine our fate in the challenges ahead. Third, it is a warning. The conditions that nearly ended our species 900,000 years ago, climate change, habitat loss, resource scarcity, population fragmentation, are not entirely alien to our current moment. The climate is changing again, faster than at almost any point in the geological record, driven this time not by orbital mechanics but by our own activities. Habitats are shrinking. Species are disappearing. The interconnected web of life that sustains us is under pressure. We are not in danger of being reduced to 1,280 individuals. Our numbers and our technology give us a buffer that our ancient ancestors did not have. But the lesson of 900,000 years ago is that the margin between survival and extinction can be narrower than it appears. The Earth does not make exceptions. Not for intelligence. Not for civilization. Not for technology. What saves a species in the end is wisdom. The wisdom to understand the world we live in. The wisdom to act on that understanding before the crisis becomes catastrophic. The wisdom to cooperate across boundaries, of tribe and nation and interest, when the situation demands it. Our ancestors had that wisdom in the most primitive form. They cooperated enough to survive. We have inherited their capacity. The question is whether we will use it. So let us gather what we have learned tonight. 900,000 years ago, the human population collapsed to 1,280 individuals, the smallest number our species has ever been. For 117,000 years, they held on. In refugia. In sheltered valleys and coastal strips and highland plateaus. Eating what they could find. Remembering what they knew. Teaching their children. Surviving. And then, slowly, they grew. They spread across Africa. Then across the world. They became millions, then billions. They became us. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let your mind rest on those survivors for a moment. A small fire in a dark landscape. A group of people, frightened and exhausted and yet, still here. Still breathing. Still holding each other against the cold. They did not know they were saving the future. They were simply trying to get through another day. And in getting through another day, and another, they gave us everything. Every song ever sung. Every painting ever made. Every story ever told. Every moment of love and laughter and discovery in all of human history. It all began with 1,280 people, who refused to give up. And one of their descendants is lying here right now, breathing slowly, safe and warm, carrying their story forward. Sleep well. You are the continuation of the oldest survival story ever told.